Welcome to the Mitchell Gallery's last exhibition for the 2020-2021 season with Lens and Brush, works by Frank E. Schoonover. I'm Lucinda Edinburgh and I'm the art educator for the Mitchell Gallery, and we're really pleased to be able to feature these works. Schoonover was a well-noted illustrator during what is called the Golden Age of American illustration. This was a period from about 1880 to 1930, where the print industry experienced a boom due to improved printing technology, rising literacy rates, and a better economy, so artists were needed to provide illustrations. Magazines, periodicals, and books flourished during this period, and the improved technology to convert color paintings into halftone pictures rather than engravings added a lot of curb appeal for the print industry. And you'll see some pictures here. The two images on the left, King Arthur and Blackbeard Buccaneer, are by Frank Schoonover, and on the right is another student, N.C. Wyeth. Frank Earl Schoonover was the second child of John Schoonover, the owner of a small iron ore industry, and Elizabeth Labar Schoonover. He was born in Oxford, New Jersey, and he notes his remembrances of the blast furnace there. The family eventually moved to Trenton, New Jersey, just blocks from the Delaware River, which provided limitless opportunities for a young boy who loved nature and adventure and the outdoors, as well as he spent summers with his grandmother in Pike County, Pennsylvania. These experiences would prove to be important resources as an illustrator. Although he was a good student, he didn't regard himself as an exceptional art student, but he had a strong interest in the subject and received encouragement from his teacher, Miss Field. He graduated from the model school in 1896 and began college applications with his parents' desire for him to become a Presbyterian minister. This plan was diverted as he felt unsuited to the ministry, and a chance sighting of an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer for false course offerings at the Drexel Institute of Arts, Science, and Industry proved to be life-changing. So in 1896, Schoonover was accepted for the four-year program in Philadelphia, and this was a city which provided a good environment for those interested in the arts. Among those living in the city at that time included William Merritt Chase, William Glackens, Cecilia Bowes, Thomas Anschutz, and Howard Pyle. It was Pyle who offered the unique training in illustration at a time when the printing industry had the ability to reproduce works of art from the artist's original drawing or painting, rather than relying upon the wood engravers who had to interpret the works into a line drawing, and that was not always very satisfying. But additionally, the works could be reproduced in color. Here you see a work by Howard Pyle himself, who was a very accomplished illustrator, and he was very particular about the students he selected to work with him. Schoonover had to prove his ability to Pyle, and did so by creating an original charcoal drawing of netting minnows, fishing, and exploring streams, all based on his time with his grandmother in Bushkill, Pennsylvania. In the beautiful catalog raisonné, Schoonover expressed his thrill and acceptance into Howard Pyle's class, saying, "I felt I was on my way to some kind of living." So that's certainly a voice of confidence. Looking back, Pyle's students were among the most distinguished artists at the time. Among them were Maxfield Parrish, Thornton and Violet Oakley, Jesse Wilcox Smith, Stanley Arthurs, and later N.C. Wyeth, and a host of others. Clearly, Schoonover understood the caliber of artists he was to join, and he was quoted as saying, "I felt about as big as a small piece of cheese." So obviously he has a good sense of humor too. Schoonover traveled to Europe over the summer of 1898, but otherwise he spent summers where on the bank of the Brandywine River He was a frequent guest of the Pyles, who lived at Chadds Ford, and these exclusive summer sessions were the start of what became known as the Brandywine School. Through his training, Schoonover received accolades from Pyle, but also from Drexel, where his works were featured along with other of Pyle's illustration students. So let's talk a little bit about his early training. First of all, it's important to remember that the photographs that are included in this exhibition were taken by Schoonover in the early age of photography. His photographs in the wilderness were taken with roll film, which was a new invention at a time when glass plates had been used, and the use of flash was also somewhat novel as well. So Schoonover is working with science and technology as an artistic device, but also as a way to record events. In this piece, Drummer Boy, which was painted in 1899 as a study, was done while he was still a student of Pyle's. Schoonover and others at the Pyle Summer School painted this colonial scene created by Pyle's models in period dress. Schoonover is the one posing in the photograph there on the left. But notice the beautiful use of red in the drum, and the jacket is pulled out in the young woman's dress. And this has been referred to elsewhere as Schoonover red. It's a color that he uses a lot, and it really pops out. The contrast of the wall of the house and the darkness of the doorway brings the figures forward in the composition. Since this was a study, this was not a work that was ever published. This piece, They Came Nearer and Nearer as They Approached, is an oil created in 1899, and it was the first illustration that he was commissioned for with Houghton Mifflin for the story A Jersey Boy in the Revolution that essentially launched his career. Pyle was very generous with his students and made sure they were well placed, and he doesn't appear to have had any sort of jealousy. He really believed in the purpose of the schooling that he gave and spread that generosity with his students. This was at a time that Schoonover began keeping his day books, which have been a valuable resource about his life and his work and travels. In 1900, Schoonover graduated from the Drexel Institute and then spent most of the summer at Chadds Ford, as well as time at Bushkill, which he had a house himself built there and spent many summers. So much is owed to Howard Pyle for his belief that an illustrator should thoroughly immerse himself in his subjects, painting those things he knows best, and Pyle believed that accuracy and realism were essential to producing high quality and believable illustrations. Consequently, Schoonover, N.C. Wyeth, Harvey Dunn, Clifford Ashley, and Sidney Chase made many road trips to have cultural and artistic experiences that would improve their work. This is a book that was put together later on, but it's actually taken from his day books, and it's called The Edge of the Wilderness. And in 1902, Schoonover traveled to Montreal to research French-Canadian stories by Gilbert Parker and W.A. Fraser. And it was following those stories that Schoonover took Pyle's advice and began to travel on his own around the U.S. and Canadian border, keeping a day book of the experience. 2 trips were made, one in 1903 for the Hudson River and again in 1911. And just to add that these were arduous trips. This piece was created just a few years into his young career, and Schoonover painted General Stryker probably as a local commission. He posed a favorite model, George Wilson, uniformed, and you can see this makeshift horse in Schoonover's studio there in Wilmington. And Schoonover shared this studio with fellow Pyle student Stanley Arthurs, who was adjacent to Pyle's ateliers in Wilmington. So General Stryker sits astride a handsome black steed in Morris Island, South Carolina, and it's actually an enlargement of an old tintype that had been taken in 1863. You will notice with some of these, because of the tone that he uses in the grisaille, sort of effect, that just using black and white, that some of the photographs and some of the paintings are hard to distinguish. This one is pretty easy, but some of them you have to really look close. He has this sort of photorealism in his work. Schoonover and Arthurs were considered Pyle's two favorite students, but by 1905, Pyle decided to close his small school of art, but he continued to provide advice and criticism for some chosen students. So Schoonover and Arthurs, along with Wyeth and Peck and Ashley, needed to find new studios, which they found on North Rodney Street in Wilmington, and that is where the studios have been restored and remain. These next few pieces really reflect social reform and his sensitivity to it. Social reform was sweeping the country during this time, and Schoonover received a series of assignments over a period of about 10 years that focused on working in social conditions. He was commissioned by McClure's Magazine and Harper's for his first muckraking assignments in 1902, and the story The Children of the Coal Shadow, published February 1903, exposed the wretched working conditions of young breaker boys in the Pennsylvania anthracite region. And you see the young age of these boys. They're so young and innocent. The photograph taken here and resulting drawing are iconic and compelling statements of young boys who work in a dark, dirty, coal environment. And just to note that this photograph was actually taken with a flash, so this was still new technology. So you see in the drawing, Schoonover actually traveled to the anthracite coal mines near Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he lived with a coal miner's family. And while he was there, he sketched and photographed life at a coal mine near Scranton for several days. So the illustrations created with charcoal reflect that somber and really dim prospects for these young boys. This piece, Fire Escape, it was done much later, about 7 years later, but I wanted to group it with the coal mine boys because Schoonover visited the silk mills in 1910 to witness for himself the women's working conditions. The silk mills were most often adjacent to the numerous anthracite coal mines, which employed the daughters and the wives of the miners. And so there was this sort of cycle that you would work in the coal mine, you would marry, she would work in the silk mill along with the children, and it was just sort of this circle that you could never quite get out of. So, to gather material for the story, Women of the Pennsylvania Silk Mills, which was published in Harper's Monthly, April 1910, Schoonover traveled to the Bliss Silk Throwing Mill in Pennsylvania with the author Florence Lucas Sanville. Sanville was the executive secretary of the Consumer League of Philadelphia, and she and the treasurer Fanny Travis Cochran had gone undercover and obtained jobs as mill hands at the Bliss Silk Mill in Peckville in order to gather information for two magazine articles. So you can see the illustration on the left, and on the right you see the photographs. You can see some of the buildings and the smoke that's coming out of it. Schoonover's visit resulted in 49 photographs and 8 illustrations. So the fire escape juxtaposes the ladies' social lunchtime break against this dramatic bird's eye industrial photograph of the collier. Schoonover's second muckraking foray in 1903 took him to the streets of New York for Ernest C. Poole's article Waifs of the Street that was published in May 1903, again from McClure's Magazine. The illustration is titled, Most Street Workers Are Inveterate Players of Craps. As with the children in the coal mines, Schoonover portrays the looks on the faces of the boys whose dreams went no further than the mines or the city streets. There's another illustration from the article that is included in our online exhibition, so do look at those. The slag dump, which was created in 1906, was part of a trip west that he did at that time. Schoonover served on a special assignment to investigate the copper mining situation with the Western Federation of Miners that resulted in the arrest and trial of several men in Butte, Montana for McClure's magazine. So these are people like Marcus Daly, William Clark, all of those guys. His illustrations and photographs were used for C.P. Donnelly's article, The Fight of the Copper Kings, which appeared in May 1907. Schoonover visited the Washoe smelter at the Anaconda Mines that was owned by Marcus Daly, and he photographed the Amalgamated Copper Company, and the article with the illustrations revealed a lot about the corruption in politics and in the copper industry in Montana. Another of Schoonover's assignments was to investigate the immigrant passengers in steerage. Harper's made arrangements for Schoonover to board the revenue cutter Königin Louise, a German Barbarossa class ship in the New York harbor, on February 28, 1908. Many of the 410 passengers in steerage were Italian. And so, from this, he created a series of illustrations. And you can see the families on the left and right. He spent an afternoon photographing the various immigrants and created a set of illustrations for the article. In fact, 13 illustrations were created for the story titled Judgment of the Steerage by Louis E. McBrain, for which he received special permits to board the ship. You can see a little bit of the red that he's included here to highlight, and the women, look out. One is feeding a child, they're socializing, but they're in the lowest class of accommodations. As I mentioned earlier, inspired by Pyle's encouragement and maybe even further motivated by his earlier trips to Montreal, Schoonover made another expedition in December 1903 in the frigid outback of the Hudson Bay area of Canada. And so, along with his guide, Xavier Gill, and others, they traveled by snowshoe and dog sled over 1,500 miles to Indian outposts and settlements of fur trappers. Consequently, there were about 26 numbered drawings and sketches that were executed in that trip. Most were in oil crayon. And so you can see the photograph of the mother with her baby. And now you see the drawing, which is done in oil crayon in 1904. Schoonover kept careful notes in his trip diary, which he included in his article, The Edge of Wilderness, which we saw the cover of a few slides back, for the April 1905 issues of Scribner's magazine. Schoonover's drawings and sketches have proved to be important documents for the Hudson Bay's early residents and for the history of the Canadian North Country. Schoonover commented that the superstition of the Indians prevented him from finishing the drawing, that their feeling against it was so strong that he said, I had to stop and leave the tent. With other families, I had no difficulty. In this same trip, this photograph was also part of the 1903-1904 Northern Expedition, which I've said repeatedly was arduous. They fished and hunted to keep from starving, and from his diary he writes that he walked some 2 miles from camp, drawing a lynx trap. He, the trapper, builds a trap called a cabane, and it's like a little house, open in the front. The back wall is the tree, the side walls are built of stakes, driven in the snow, and the roof is topped with green balsam boughs. And here you see the oil crayon drawing that he's created, almost replicating the photograph. And you can see the structure, you can see all the snow around him. The oil crayon illustration follows the photograph almost faithfully. Traps would be set to capture lynx, but lynx were also looking for food in the traps as well, so there's sort of a cycle with this. The illustration appeared in Schoonover's story Breaking Trail, which was published in Scribner's magazine in May of 1905. Among Schoonover's most iconic images are those of Hopalong Cassidy. And some of you may remember the TV series or the movies, or you've seen them in reruns. But in the early part of the 20th century, the American West was viewed as a place of cowboys and exotic Indians, and they were the subjects of many articles and stories and books that provided opportunities for illustrators. Since Schoonover had taken his expedition and lived with the Native Americans, he could create these authentic works from the artifacts brought back, as well as from the continued trips to the western states, where he created charcoal, pastel, and crayon drawings because transporting canvases just was not practical or maybe even possible. So Schoonover created the first images of the legendary Hopalong Cassidy, the hero depicted in Clarence Mulford's book Bar 20. And this work on oil on Columbia canvas was created in his studio with his favorite model named O'Donnell. Mulford described his main character to Schoonover as a sun-baked old roughneck cowboy named Cassidy who had a decided limp. So Schoonover asked if the cowboy, with his injuries, did he hop along? To which the author answered yes. So Schoonover suggested then that he be called Hopalong Cassidy, and a legend was born. This painting is the first image of the famed Hopalong Cassidy and is one of Schoonover's most celebrated paintings, and so he did the book covers for all of the subsequent books. As it says in the catalog raisonné, the sun-bleached wood, the texture of the cowboy boots, the haze of the gun smoke, and the weathered hat with matches in his band reflect Schoonover's attention to detail in many of his illustrations. And so, of course, Cassidy was immortalized through the mid-20th century in the movies and television shows with actor William Boyd. And you can go online and see on YouTube, some of these movies, for free. He wore a black hat. He had a white horse. The good guys always won. And William Boyd himself tried to keep a good character and be a good role model for the children that followed the series. You see the roughness of the boots, that he's picked up the detail, and you get this sort of scowl that he's imposed, on Hopalong, and the belt of ammunition, and just a real rough and tough kind of guy. Schoonover's second grand foray into the Canadian wilderness took place during the summer of 1911. Unlike the rigors of the 1903 and 1904 trek, this was more recreational canoeing and fishing that inspired this trip. Schoonover took about 180 photographs during this journey. So this is one you see here. And then you see the painting, which is also on our exhibition announcement. From his journal, he wrote, "This long canoe trip gave me a fine idea of the summer life of the Indian. I saw the coming of the fur brigades to the post." His story, The Fur Harvester, was published in Harper's Monthly magazine, October 1912. And during this journey, he collected ephemera and artifacts which actually remain in the Schoonover studios from both of those trips. He uses a beautiful glow in the sky and in the water, and you get the sense of that Canadian north light. And the man, looking out beyond just the boat. This piece, Made of the Forest, created in 1913, was oil on canvas, and Schoonover was very particular about how his illustrations should be published. He didn't want his images altered or cropped, as most artists don't, and this often occurs to accommodate the text. He felt that the compositions were created for a direct reason and further complained that he disliked the long, narrow pictures that are meant to be spaced around type, and we certainly saw that with the women and the silk mills. He said that the world is not to be viewed through a keyhole at all times, and asked that they consider reproducing the images as they were. So you see the model here up on the right. She's on a platform there in the studio, and then he's created a background based on his travels and experience following the Canadian wilderness. Plumed Snake Medicine, 1924. This work appeared on the April 24th, 1924 cover of American Boy, and this is an image of a Native American on a Blackfoot reservation. Schooner lived among the Blackfeet Indians on the northern plains and also with the Alaskan Eskimos to experience firsthand the world portrayed in Jack London's To Build a Fire, which he also illustrated. And this was a short story about a protagonist who ventures out in the sub-zero tundras of the Yukon territory, accompanied only by his dog. So the artist's wilderness experiences would inspire his art throughout his career, making authentic portrayals of the far reaches of America possible. This illustration, Scout on a Horse, appeared on the cover of American Boy magazine, February 1926. Unlike George Wilson, who posed for the General Stryker image we saw earlier and was created 20 years earlier, this model, most likely Charles Ryan, had a real saddle to sit on. So Schoonover's prolific career can hardly be covered in one lecture or one exhibition. He illustrated for many magazines and books, creating over 150 magazine and book covers during the golden age of American illustration. He taught at the John Herron Art Institute as well as his own studio and painted many landscapes of the Brandywine and Delaware River valleys. Schoonover's photographs are included in the forthcoming book, Through His Own Lens, the documentary photography of Frank E. Schoonover, which we had hoped to have on the walls in the Mitchell Gallery, but due to COVID, we are restricted to only online. Schoonover's works are seen in the U.S. and Canada, including the Delaware Art Museum, Biggs Museum of American Art, and other major institutions. And I want to thank Mr. John Schoonover, the president and curator of Schoonover Studios, and Louise Schoonover Smith for helping make this exhibition possible. See the other images on our online exhibition on our website. Thank you for participating in our exhibition season, and we look forward to greeting you in late August with an outdoor sculpture exhibition on the quad of St. John's College. So be well, be safe, and hope to see you later in the summer.